Imagine a civilization on the absolute brink of total collapse. Like, the economy has inflated into this entirely unsustainable bubble.
Right, a complete house of cards.
Exactly. The leaders are becoming increasingly cruel and erratic, and the citizens are violently turning on each other in the streets.
Yeah.
And if you were, a historian or a systems analyst tasked with diagnosing the fatal flaw of this society, you'd probably look at its wealth distribution, right? Or maybe it's military overreach or a sudden scarcity of natural resources.
Sure, you look at the physical metrics first.
Right. But what if the actual root cause, the real malware that crashes an entire civilization, was simply a failure in how its citizens process logic?
It is a terrifying premise because,
So.
well, it is entirely invisible at first.
Yeah.
We like to measure the health of a society by looking at things we can, weigh and count. GDP, grain reserves, megawatt output.
Tangible things.
Exactly. But a civilization doesn't collapse because it runs out of bricks. It collapses because the architects lose the ability to accurately evaluate the load-bearing capacity of reality.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. And that invisible diagnostic landscape is exactly where we are heading today. We are taking a highly analytical, borderline surgical lens to a text that most people usually read with this soft, glowing, almost mystical reverence.
Yeah, they really do.
I'm talking about G.A. Parwez's structural analysis of Surah 26, specifically verses 75 to 104 from the Quran. And for you, the listener joining us, our mission in this deep dive is to completely strip away centuries of religious sentimentality.
We have to.
Right. We are going to examine this text not as a collection of magical incantations or spiritual poetry, but as a masterclass in sociological engineering and first principles.
Because Parwez treats this text as a survival manual for civilizational architecture.
Yeah.
It is a deep exploration of how societies function, why they rot from the inside out, and the specific cognitive architecture required to keep them running in alignment with objective reality.
So let's jump right into the provocation, because there is a phrase in verse 26.89 that completely derailed my previous understanding of this entire subject.
I know exactly which one you mean.
It is arguably one of the most quotable, famous phrases in the text. Ila man ata Allaha biqalbin salim. Now, the standard translation, the one printed on like a million tapestries and quoted in countless sermons, is, except whoever comes with a sound heart.
The infamous sound heart.
Yes. And universally, across almost all the literature I've seen, this is spiritualized into what looks to me like utter meaninglessness.
Right, this becomes a platitude.
Exactly. A sound heart becomes a metaphor for just being a nice, pious person. It means you meditate, you harbor no grudges, you think clean thoughts, and you have this inner mystical purity.
Yeah.
But looking at the structural analysis we're utilizing today, that reading actively obscures the actual diagnosis being made. Right?
It doesn't just obscure it, it completely neutralizes the radical nature of the text.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, to understand what is actually being said, we have to look at the engineering of the language itself.
Yeah.
The word salim comes from the root salama. And in classical Arabic, salama does not mean nice or pious or meditative.
What does it mean?
It is an architectural and structural term. It means soundness, integrity, wholeness, and crucially, freedom from defect.
Look, let me pause you there. Freedom from defect. So if we are applying this to a physical object, say a bridge.
Good example.
A bridge with salama isn't a morally good bridge. It's a bridge that doesn't collapse when a fleet of commercial trucks drives over it.
That is the exact metric. The bridge has salama because its structural integrity matches the physical reality of the weight it must bear.
Right.
Now apply that to the qalb, the heart. In this sociological framework, the qalb is not the muscular organ pumping blood.
No.
Nor is it the poetic seat of romantic feelings. It is the cognitive decision center of a human being. It is the engine of rationality.
Oh, wow.
So when you put them together, a qalb salim, you are not talking about a person who is free from theological sin.
Right.
You are talking about a mind that is operating with structural integrity. It is an epistemologically clean heart.
An epistemologically clean heart. That is a dense academic phrase.
It is, yeah.
Let's ground that for the listener, because epistemology is simply the study of how we know what we know. So what does it look like in practice to have a clean cognitive decision center?
Think of it as a mind with absolutely no hidden agendas corrupting its evaluations.
Okay.
It means there are no vested interests filtering the conclusions you arrive at. And most importantly, it means you have no blind loyalty to a system whose primary function is simply its own self-preservation.
Right.
You evaluate data purely on its merit, not on whether it benefits your tribe, your bank account, or your inherited worldview.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, the true enemy of the sound heart isn't doing something bad in a conventional moralistic sense.
Yeah.
The enemy is captured rationality.
Captured rationality is the perfect term. Let's say your income, your social status, and your comfort all depend on believing that the Earth is flat. Your rationality is instantly captured. You cannot evaluate astronomical data honestly because your mind is structurally defective. Your cognitive bridge will collapse under the weight of real evidence because the support beams are made of vested interests.
It's like a judge presiding over a major corporate lawsuit where they secretly own millions in stock in the defendant's company.
Exactly.
That judge might sit on the bench and genuinely feel impartial. They might pray every morning and feel they have a pure heart.
Sure.
But structurally, their rationality is entirely compromised. Their evaluations are being filtered through a subconscious system that desperately needs a specific outcome to survive.
And this sets the stage for everything that follows in this analysis. If a structurally sound mind, this uncaptured rationality, is the ultimate goal and the absolute prerequisite for building a functioning civilization, then we have to identify the primary virus that infects it.
Right.
What is the malware that captures human rationality on a mass scale?
Which brings up the character of Abraham in verses 26.75 to 77. But I want to be careful here because we are not looking at Abraham, the religious icon, the guy with the flowing robes.
No, absolutely not.
In this deep dive, we are treating Abraham as a systems engineer, the ultimate societal reformer operating entirely from first principles.
And the very first thing this systems engineer does is target the ancestral architecture of his society. The malware.
Right. He looks at his society and asks a devastatingly simple, almost incessant question. He says, have you seen what you worship, you and your ancient forefathers?
It's so direct.
It really is. But let me push back on this. Let me play devil's advocate for the architects of that society. Isn't tradition generally a good thing?
What?
I mean, think of Chesterton's fence, the idea that you shouldn't tear down a traditional structure until you understand why it was built in the first place. Isn't tradition the necessary social glue of any civilization? Why is Abraham so hostile to the concept of inherited systems?
Because of the operating logic of that tradition. Abraham isn't against history. He is against blind assertion.
Okay.
The text uses a structurally precise phrase here. Abraham says of these inherited idol systems, they are all enemies to me. Adumnes.
Enemies to me. I'll be honest, that sounds incredibly personal. It sounds like a theological rivalry, like a turf war between his god and their gods.
It is heavily interpreted that way, historically, but structurally it isn't personal at all. The idol systems are not merely theologically offensive to Abraham, they are structurally opposed to his function.
Explain that.
Think about what a reformer is trying to do. Abraham is attempting to build a society based on rational evaluation, cause and effect, and objective reality.
Yeah.
You cannot maintain a productive relationship with a system that runs entirely on inherited assertion.
Because the underlying operating systems are just fundamentally incompatible. You can't run a modern program on an abacus.
Exactly. You just can't. The operating logic of blind following is what the source text elsewhere likens to the path of animals.
The path of animals.
Yeah. Animals move in a herd without conscious evaluation of the sociological structures around them. If your justification for a societal law, an economic policy, or a power structure is simply because our forefathers did it, you have forcefully shut down the cognitive decision center.
You've bricked the system.
Yes. You have institutionalized, captured rationality across the entire population.
Let's dig into that concept of the path of animals, because the source material really hammers this point. Blindly following inherited tradition without actively evaluating it is essentially a systemic failure to use the one specific tool that makes us human, our intellect.
It is an absolute abdication of human responsibility.
Yeah.
Let's look at how civilizations adapt. If a society's primary operating logic is, we do it this way because it's always been done this way,
Yeah.
it loses the mechanism for error correction.
Right.
When the environment changes, when a crisis hits, they cannot adapt. They just repeat the old rituals harder.
Which never works.
Never. Abraham recognizes that these idol systems aren't just quaint cultural practices or harmless community bonding. They're catastrophic architectural flaws that will eventually cause the entire civilizational structure to collapse under stress. Therefore, they are enemies to the project of human survival.
And this inevitable structural collapse brings us to a fascinating concept of capital, because the text moves from pure ideology right into brutal socioeconomic reality.
It really shifts gears.
In verses 26.88-89, It talks about the day when neither wealth, mal, nor sons banun will benefit anyone. Now, historically, this is read as an apocalyptic warning about the literal end of the world, where your money can't buy your way out of purgatory.
Which completely strips the text of its immediate real-world utility.
Yeah.
We need to look at what mal and ban represent in a functioning day-to-day society. They are forms of capital. Mal is economic capital, raw wealth. Banun, while literally translated as sons or offspring, represents in a broader systemic sense your networks, your tribal backing, your political connections.
Your social capital.
It is your social capital.
But wait, money and connections always insulate you. In every societal collapse in human history, the rich and well-connected usually survive while the poor suffer. Why does this text confidently claim that on a certain day, this economic and social capital becomes completely useless?
Because we have to ask how that capital was accumulated and within what paradigm it holds value.
Okay.
If your wealth is accumulated within a flawed, unproven system, a system built on inherited assertions, artificial scarcity, or exploitation, it isn't real capital. It's a localized bubble.
Interesting.
And if your social networks are maintained within a closed, self-referential architecture that fundamentally rejects reality, that isn't real social capital either. It's just a mafia running on borrowed time.
I'm trying to visualize this. It's like having billions of dollars in Enron stock the day before the accounting fraud is exposed to the public.
Oh, that is a phenomenal analogy.
Thanks. Because within the closed system of that corporate illusion, you are a billionaire. You have immense capital. You have power. But the moment the system faces a structural reckoning, the moment the fake numbers have to interface with objective mathematical reality, that capital evaporates to absolute zero.
Completely. The day of accounting isn't just a mystical event at the end of the universe. It is the inevitable, brutal moment of structural collapse that happens when a society operates contrary to the laws of reality.
Wow.
And in that moment of collapse, when the Enron stock of a civilization goes to zero, what is the only thing that retains its value?
The Qalb Salim, the uncaptured rational center.
Precisely. Because only a mind that can accurately evaluate reality, free from the delusions and vested interests of the collapsed system, can produce outcomes that survive.
Right.
If you are deeply invested in the illusion, you go down with the ship. The uncaptured intellect is the only true capital because it is the only tool capable of surveying the rubble and rebuilding from first principles.
That drastically shifts the perspective on this entire text. We are talking about the illusion of capital within a failing paradigm. So, if inherited tradition and blind assertion constitute the malware, the flawed architecture, what exactly does the correct code look like?
Right. How do we fix it?
Yeah. How does a reformer actually build a society from scratch without relying on tradition?
To find that out, we have to look at Abraham's cosmological argument in verses 26.78 to 82. This is where he lays out the foundational operating system.
Okay, let me read this sequence, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. To a modern listener, this just sounds like a standard, highly sentimental prayer.
I know.
Abraham says, "It is the Lord who created me and guides me, who feeds me and gives me drink, and when I am ill, heals me, who causes me to die and gives me life, and who I desire will forgive my errors." I mean, it's beautiful poetry, but it sounds like a guy asking a magical sky father for personal favors.
It absolutely sounds that way if you have been conditioned by centuries of religious sentimentality. But Parwez's structural analysis completely dismantles that assumption.
How so?
This is not a prayer list. It is a highly precise, sequential description of a rational order's operating functions, governed by strict cause and effect, what the text calls tabai kwanan, or immutable physical laws.
Let's pause and unpack that, because making the leap from God feeds me to strict physical laws is massive.
It is a big leap.
Let's break this down function by function, starting with creation and guidance in verse 78. How is that an operating function?
In any rational system, existence must have a defined purpose and direction. Creation establishes the existence of the system, the raw material, the physical universe.
Okay.
Guidance is the embedded logic, the physical and biological laws that dictate how that universe operates. It means the system isn't random, it has trajectory. Gravity works a certain way, thermodynamics work a certain way. The universe has rules.
So it's essentially saying, here is the hardware of the universe, and here is the fundamental operating system that guides how it processes data.
Yes. Now look at the next function, feeding and healing in verses 79 and 80. This is about the sustaining systems of physical life. And the source text is incredibly specific here about how this works.
Right.
The Lord of the worlds, as a principle, does not literally drop perfectly baked loaves of bread from the sky into your mouth.
Right. There is no supernatural room service.
Mhm.
If you just sit in a field and pray to be fed, you will starve to death.
Exactly. To be fed, humans must engage in the economy and the physical laws of the earth. They must understand soil chemistry, plow the earth, sow the seeds, track the seasons, harvest the crop, mill the grain, and bake the bread.
That's a lot of work.
It is. The feeding happens exclusively through the strict laws of agriculture and economics. If a society ignores those laws, if it stops planting, or if it corrupts its economic distribution, it starves. The operating system doesn't magically intervene to save a society from its own irrationality.
And the exact same logic applies to healing. The text specifically calls out the danger of superstition here. Relying on amulets, what the text calls tawiz or magic threads, or chanting spells to cure a biological illness is a fundamental systemic failure.
It is a failure because it completely ignores the cause and effect reality of the biological universe. Think about historical examples where societies collapsed because they substituted medical science with magical thinking.
Oh, like the plague.
Yes. During the Black Death, populations that relied entirely on superstition rather than quarantine and sanitation suffered catastrophic losses. Healing requires medicine. It requires science. It requires understanding the biological mechanisms of disease and applying a physical intervention.
So to say God heals me in this structural framework actually means the universe contains the physical laws and medicinal properties required for healing, and I am required to use my uncaptured rational intellect to discover and apply them.
Precisely. If you try to fix a biological hardware problem by chanting a superstitious software spell, the system crashes. The patient dies because you have abandoned the rational operating system for a superstitious one.
This brings us to a really counterintuitive part of the sequence, death and life, in verse 81. Why is death included as a functional requirement of a perfect operating system? In most religious frameworks, death is viewed as a punishment for original sin, like a tragedy.
Because without finitude, a system stagnates. In the systems engineering context, finitude is what makes human choices consequential.
Right.
Think about the concept of planned obsolescence, but in a positive evolutionary sense. If there were no death, no end to a sequence, there would be no urgency, no need for sustainable systems, no requirement for progress.
The stakes would be zero.
Exactly. The cycle of life and death is the engine of generational turnover. It clears the cache.
There's the cash. I like
Yeah.
that.
It allows old, corrupted cognitive structures to die off, allowing new, uncaptured rationality to evaluate the world fresh. Death isn't a punishment. It is a necessary systemic function for the renewal of civilization.
That is a staggering reframe, death as a cache-clearing mechanism for societal processing power. Which brings us to the final point in Abraham's sequence, forgiveness, in verse 82. Now, I have to push back again.
Go ahead.
In a religious context, forgiveness is entirely about appeasing an angry deity so you don't go to hell. It's begging for a pardon. How does a structural analysis possibly read this as a physical law?
By understanding what forgiveness actually achieves in a system, in engineering, what is forgiveness? It is an error correction protocol. It is the built-in redundancy and corrective mechanism that allows the system to recover from inevitable mistakes. If a system, whether it's a computer network or a human civilization, has no protocol for handling errors, a single mistake will cause a catastrophic failure.
So forgiveness here means that the universe is designed with resilience. If a society makes a mistake, if it violates a social or economic law and begins to suffer the consequences, the universe isn't designed to permanently annihilate them on the first offense. There is a window.
Right.
They can recognize the error, apply the corrective measures, and realign with the rational path.
Yes. The Lord of the Worlds in this entire sequence is not framed as a supernatural monarch demanding appeasement and flattery. The term represents the foundational, immutable principle behind these operating systems.
Okay.
Abraham isn't praying to a king. He is describing the fundamental architecture of reality. He is laying down the unchangeable rules of the game. Purpose, sustenance through effort, biological reality, finitude, and error correction.
Okay, if the universe operates on these strict, unforgiving physical and social laws, it raises a very practical dilemma. How does a reformer actually survive and operate within this reality without just being crushed by the weight of the old, corrupt architecture?
It's incredibly difficult.
Right, because if you walk into a society built on inherited superstition and start demanding strict rational evaluation, they are going to destroy you.
That is the exact problem Abraham addresses next. This brings us to the law of requital, or mukafat-i-amal, and its relationship to social function. Right after laying out the operating system of the universe, Abraham makes a series of petitions in verses 83 to 87.
Let me list these out because, again, they sound deeply personal. He asks for Hukum, he asks for lisan aidq, he asks for Jannat, and he asks for the forgiveness of his misguided father. I'm struggling with the leap here. How do we not read these as an individual saying, give me wisdom, give me a good reputation, give me a spot in heaven, and save my dad?
We avoid that reading by rigorously applying the structural lens we just established. Every single one of these petitions is a statement about social function and the preconditions required to execute a reform movement.
Okay.
They are not requests for personal afterlife rewards. They are requests for the necessary tools to do the hard work of societal engineering here and now.
Let's take them one by one and test that theory. First, he asks for Hukum, which is usually translated as wisdom or judgment. What is Hukum in Parwez's framework?
Hukum is the capacity for sound judgment, but it's highly specific. It is intelligence that is completely uncontaminated by vested interests.
Wait, isn't that just a repetition of the Qalb Salim, the clean heart?
It is the operationalization of the clean heart.
Yeah.
You can be highly intelligent, you can have a massive IQ and understand complex systems, but if your intelligence is used merely to rationalize your own greed or to protect a corrupt system that benefits you, you do not have Hukum.
Right.
You have processing power, but a corrupted algorithm. Abraham is asking for the cognitive clarity to make decisions based solely on objective reality, regardless of the political or personal cost.
That makes perfect sense. What about the next one? He asks for a lisan enishku file akirin, a truthful tongue among the later ones. That just sounds like a guy who wants to be famous. He wants to be remembered fondly in the history books.
Not at all. This is about the durability and verifiability of the rational argument he is introducing. He is asking for reputation across time. Why? Because a systemic reform cannot rely on the charisma of a single founder.
Oh, because if it does...
If a movement relies only on Abraham's dynamic personality, it dies the moment he dies.
So he's essentially asking that his arguments stand up to peer review across centuries.
Exactly. He is saying, let the structural truth of my argument remain honest, let it be verified by future generations, and let it remain relevant to future communities. It's an insistence that the principles of rational evaluation outlast the individual. It's the establishment of a continuous, verifiable tradition of reason, institutionalizing reason, as opposed to the inherited tradition of blind assertion he was fighting.
Wow. Okay, now here is the massive one, the one I have the hardest time swallowing. He asks to be made an heir of Jannat al-Naim, the garden of pleasure. If there is one concept in this text that billions of people universally understand as a mystical afterlife waiting room filled with literal rivers and couches, it's Jannat. Are you telling me this text strips the mysticism entirely out of heaven?
According to this structural analysis, reading Jannat purely as a post-mortem resort is perhaps the most tragic misreading of all. In Parwez's framework, Jannat heaven, the garden is a tangible state of social flourishing.
Here, on Earth.
Yes, it is the logical, inevitable socioeconomic result that occurs in this world when a society actually operates according to rational, equitable laws.
Hold on. You are taking a concept that is the ultimate spiritual reward and reducing it to a functional earthly economy. That is a massive leap. How does he justify that?
By looking at the root of the text's promises, what does Jannat provide? Security, abundance, equity, the absence of fear, and the absence of exploitation. Are these magical concepts, or are they the hallmarks of a perfectly engineered society?
I mean, they're the goals of every functional state.
Right. When a civilization eliminates systemic exploitation, when it operates on uncontaminated intelligence, when it respects the dignity of every human being, the resulting socioeconomic environment is Jannat. Abraham isn't asking for a ticket to the afterlife. He is stating the ultimate goal of his sociological engineering project. He is asking for the realization of a flourishing society here on Earth.
So it's not a reward you get after you die for believing the right things. It's the society you build while you're alive by executing the right operating system.
Exactly.
But this brings up a really messy tension, because right after envisioning this perfect, rational, frictionless society, Abraham asks for something incredibly messy and personal. He asks for the forgiveness of his father.
Yeah.
And the text explicitly says his father was among the misguided, one of the primary architects of the inherited idol system. Why introduce this deeply personal, irrational element into a strictly structural argument?
Because systems are made of people, and people are flawed. This petition demonstrates the limits of reform and the brutal reality of dealing with compromised nodes in a network.
Let me try to wrap my head around this with an analogy. Is this like a systems engineer coming into a massive corporation to upgrade their entire tech stack?
Okay.
But deep in the basement, there is this one failing ancient legacy server that holds critical historical data. The engineer knows the server is structurally compromised, it runs on terrible code, it crashes constantly, but instead of immediately taking a sledgehammer to it, they try to patch it. They try to isolate it, feed it new code, and bring it into alignment with the new rational path, at least until it proves completely irredeemable.
That is exactly what is happening. Abraham's father represents the deeply erratic, structurally compromised element of the old society. But Abraham doesn't just immediately write him off. The request for forgiveness here isn't about magical absolution. It's an expression of the reformer's continuous, exhausting effort to rehabilitate the misguided. He's trying to patch the legacy server.
But historically, we know the patch doesn't take.
It doesn't. And the source text is unflinchingly clear about what happens next. There comes a point of structural incompatibility. The text notes that when it became undeniably clear that the father's enmity, his structural opposition to the rational order, was permanent and unyielding, Abraham had to cut ties. He had to quarantine the server.
Because if you keep trying to integrate a fundamentally hostile, irrational element into a system that requires strict logical coherence, the irrational element will eventually act as a virus and crash the whole network.
Yes.
Empathy is required, effort is required, but they cannot override the structural integrity of the entire system.
Precisely. And this harsh reality, the necessity of disconnecting the corrupt elements to save the whole, brings us to the inverse of the Garden of Flourishing. If jhana is the tangible state of social flourishing that occurs when the rational system works, what does the failure of that system look like?
Which brings us to the concept of hell Jahannam. Because if heaven is a functioning earthly society, then hell isn't a fiery pit beneath the earth. It is the present tense reality of a collapsed society.
Jahannam is societal rot playing out in real time. And the absolute core indicator of this rot, the primary diagnostic metric that shows a society is sliding into Jahannam, is the erosion of human dignity.
The concept in the text of Karam Nabani Adam, we have honored the children of Adam.
Yes. In a structurally sound system, human dignity is an absolute non-negotiable first principle. It is built into the foundation. When a society begins to stray from rational laws, when its rationality becomes captured by vested interest, the very first thing it sacrifices is the inherent dignity of the individual. It replaces equity with systemic humiliation.
I want to spend some serious time on the historical anecdote provided in the sources regarding this because it blew me away. It's a literal case study in sociological rot and how a healthy system is supposed to react to it. It involves Umar, the second caliph, and his governor of Homs, a man named Said bin Amir. Walk me through this.
It perfectly illustrates the zero-tolerance policy a rational system must have toward humiliation. The governor of this major province, Said bin Amir, is dealing with a non-Muslim citizen.
Okay.
The citizen is being difficult, and in a momentary lapse of frustration, the governor says to him, "May Allah humiliate you." It's a curse born of anger.
Just a verbal insult. I mean, today, politicians say infinitely worse things on social media before breakfast and their poll numbers go up. We reward political humiliation. But what does this governor do?
He resigns. He immediately travels to Umar and says, "I am no longer fit to hold power."
Over an insult. That is practically unfathomable to a modern political mind. Why does he resign?
Because he realizes that by verbally highlighting the dignity of a human being, even an angry citizen, even someone outside his own faith tradition, he has instantly revealed a profound structural defect in his own rationality.
Wow.
The insult isn't just bad manners. It is a violation of the foundational operating system. If the foundational premise of the society is Karam Nabani Adam, absolute human dignity, then an administrator who uses his power or position to humiliate a citizen has proven that he is capable of systemic cruelty. He has introduced a virus into the code, and Umar accepts the resignation immediately. There's no debate.
Because if you allow that one crack in the foundation, if you allow the state to humiliate even one citizen without consequence, you have invited the virus in. And the source text connects this directly to a deep psychological disease. It uses the specific term sadism. Let's dissect the psychology of sadism because it feels incredibly relevant to how modern societies operate.
The psychology of sadism is the ultimate hallmark of a collapsing society. Think about how fragile elites operate. When a civilization runs on unproven assertions and inherited wealth, it inevitably creates massive inequalities.
Right.
The people running the system know, on some subconscious level, that their power is illegitimate. It isn't based on merit, it's based on an illusion. Therefore, their egos become incredibly fragile.
Right, because their status could evaporate the moment reality asserts itself.
Exactly. And how do fragile, illegitimate egos protect themselves? By turning to the humiliation of the weak. The systemic degradation of the underclass becomes a psychological coping mechanism for the elites. They extract pleasure, sadistic satisfaction from crushing others because punching down temporarily validates their own false sense of superiority.
It's a coping mechanism for an irrational system. Instead of fixing the socioeconomic disparities, the system just institutionalizes cruelty. It breeds this sadistic mentality where leaders must humiliate minorities or political opponents or the poor just to feel tall.
And that rot, that internal decay of empathy and rationality, is Jahannam. It is hell. It isn't waiting for you after you die. It is the sociopathic environment you're currently living in.
The text provides this incredibly grim sociological imagery of the final stage of this collapse. When the system finally breaks down under the weight of its own irrationality, when the economy tanks and the institutions crumble, the text describes the leaders and the blind followers ending up in a literal circular firing squad.
It's a brilliant depiction of societal implosion. The followers, who abdicated their cognitive responsibility and chose the path of animals, turn on the leaders in a panic and say, "You misled us. You caused this destruction."
Naturally.
And the leaders turn right back and say, "We didn't force you. You had your own minds, but you chose to follow our illusions because it was easier than thinking for yourselves."
It's the ultimate abdication of responsibility. They are violently tearing each other apart, completely unable to save themselves because their entire socioeconomic system was never grounded in reality to begin with. The building is collapsing, and instead of finding the exits, they are arguing over who authorized the faulty blueprints.
And no one can save them. Because the only tool capable of finding an exit, the uncaptured intellect, the Qualb Salim, was the very thing they eradicated to maintain their comfortable illusion.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this deep dive. Let's pull back from the smoke and rubble of societal collapse and return to the individual's role. We need to synthesize what Abraham represents in this text compared to other models of reform.
The source draws a fascinating contrast here between Moses and Abraham. It points out that while figures like Moses operated under immense, immediate political pressure, he was confronting Pharaoh directly, navigating a real-time hostage crisis, and leading a physical exit of a captive population. Abraham's operation is fundamentally different.
Abraham operates purely at the level of first principles. Moses is doing emergency crisis management. Abraham is writing the fundamental code for the operating system of civilization.
Exactly. Abraham systematically dismantles inherited assertion. He constructs the rational cosmological argument from scratch, demonstrating cause and effect. He names the absolute structural incompatibility between idle systems and rational evaluation. And most importantly, he describes the exact qualities of mind required to sustain reality. Which brings us full circle to the Qualb Salim, the sound heart.
Let's get the final word on this concept. After exploring all of this, the operating systems, the societal collapse, the illusion of capital, why is the Qualb Salim the central, foundational concept of this entire text?
Because it names the absolute precondition for everything else we have discussed. You cannot build Jannat, a flourishing equitable society, if the people building it have corrupted cognitive centers. A reformer who has a captured rationality, who secretly owes loyalty to the inherited architecture, who has vested interests in the current system, or who adapts their conclusions just to protect their livelihood, simply cannot do what Abraham does. They cannot evaluate reality honestly.
The sound heart is not a spiritual achievement. It is a structural requirement for honest social evaluation. If your mind is infected with the virus of inherited assertion, every system you build will eventually rot into sadism and collapse into Jahannam.
Which is why the Quran's ultimate claim in 26.89 is that on the day of structural reckoning, this uncaptured intellect is the only capital that retains its value. Everything else, your wealth, your networks, your status within the broken system, evaporates.
Which leaves us with a critical question, one I want to put directly to you, the listener. As you look at the architecture of your own life, your career, your beliefs, your participation in society, look closely at the first principles governing your decisions. How many of those principles are actually the result of your own rigorous, rational evaluation? And how many of them are just inherited assertions, comfortable illusions, quietly waiting in the foundation to cause a structural collapse? Because when the X-ray machine of reality is finally turned on, a clean heart won't be measured by how pious you felt, but by how much truth you could structurally withstand.